Odprto. Pogovori o prostoru, arhitekturi in oblikovanju.
Lepo pozdravljeni v novi oddaji podkasta Odprto. Tokrat se bomo prepustili fantaziji in pokukali v prihodnost. Pogovarjamo se o prostoru in arhitekturi prihodnosti. Katero smer nakazuje prostorski razvoj? Kakšna bo arhitektura prihodnosti? Katere družbene spremembe bodo vplivale na grajen prostor in kako? O tem se pogovarjamo z Oono Horx Strathern iz Zukunftsinstituta, ki že 25 let s pomočjo družbeno-demografskih trendov zreva prihodnost. Ikonični film iz leta 1982 Iztrebljevalec je postavljen v Los Angeles naše sedanjosti, v leto 2019. Ustvarjalci filma so velemesto in družbo prihodnosti v nekaterih pogledih upodobili pravilno, v drugih pa napačno. Na primer, pravilno so napovedali, da bo videoklic povsem vsakdanja praksa. Prav tako so zadeli, da bodo stanovanja postala zelo majhna. Glavni lik živi v mikrostanovanju. Zmotili so se glede naprednih robotov, ki jih na prvi pogled praktično ni mogoče ločiti od ljudi. In pa glede klasike skoraj vseh futurističnih vizij, letečih avtomobilov, katere še vedno vsi nestrpno pričakujemo. Filmi o prihodnosti so skoraj edini vir, kjer lahko uzremo vizije ali pa ideje o tem, kako bo v prihodnosti izgledala arhitektura. Pri tem gre največkrat za preambiciozne ali pa drzne predstave, ki se le redko izpolnijo, oziroma je potrebno več časa, da se realizirajo, saj se prostor v resnici spreminja zelo počasi. Kako potem uzreti realističen pogled na prostor prihodnosti? Ena od možnosti je slediti družbeno-demografskim trendom in razumeti, kako lahko ti vplivajo na prostorski razvoj. S tem se ukvarja današnja sogovornica, ki nas bo popeljala v arhitekturo prihodnosti in nas hkrati prizemljila v pričakovanjih, da nas ne odnese predaleč. Hello, Oona.
Hello, Lenka.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight here in Wander Hotel. We are going to talk about the future living in built environment. You are working as a researcher at the Zukunftsinstitut. So, what was so interesting about the future for you? Not now in a professional way, but first in this personal way, maybe.
That's a very difficult question. I've never thought about that. I always think about the future in terms of my work, in terms of architecture, in terms of cities. But I've never really thought about why I'm interested in the future. I think maybe because of when I met my husband, he was very interested in science fiction and the future, and so we discussed a lot. And then through our studies and through meeting, we set up our institute. And we just started thinking about how our pictures of the future are, how we could make a better future. And so we set up an institute in Hamburg called Trendov, and then it evolved and changed and became the Zukunftsinstitut. And we've been working 25 years with futures. We started off with more like small trends, but now we work with big social demographic trends. So we've really kind of evolved and grown, if you like.
It's really interesting because future is something that bothers everybody, and we all think about the future, what is going to happen, especially in architecture. So in your Zukunftsinstitut, you identified 12 megatrends that are happening in societies across the whole world. How did you decide on the specific megatrends, and what criteria did you use to identify them?
Yeah, the 12 megatrends, they're like the big, you could say, a revolution in slow motion. All these trends are something that have kind of grown, if you like, organically, how we've observed trends over the years, and then they've grown together in clusters, and each cluster is a particular megatrend. So, for example, we see megatrend urbanization, or megatrend women, or megatrend ecology. So these are all trends which have kind of conglomerated, which have grown together over the years. But what's interesting about the trends, all these mega trends, is they're all interconnected. So you really can't think about one mega trend without, if you want to benefit from it or if you want to understand it more, think about its connection to all the other mega trends. So, for example, what happens with ecology and urbanization? So we see the trend to greener cities. So we can see how the trends connect and how there are parallels. It's a kind of very three-dimensional. You think of it like the way we draw it, in fact, is like an underground map. If you think of the underground map of London or New York, and that's how we see it. So each of the different megatrends are a different color, like a different train line, and they all kind of interconnect. And there are lots of little stations, and all the little stations are different little trends, which make up the bigger trend. So that's how you have to visualize it.
Nice. Megatrends are shifts that occur in societies. They show us changes on how people live, how people function, how do we communicate, how we socialize, and so on. How do these changes impact the built environment, architecture, and the construction industry? Or maybe vice versa, that the building environment impacts the communication, the way we live?
I think it's very much a two-way process. And I think the challenge now for our society is to work with better architecture to improve the life quality of people. So if we look at a mega trend like individualization, we look at how family structures have changed, how we see that there aren't so many. In the old days, you had families that stuck together. You had families maybe with one or two children. And today we have many more, what we say, individualized types of family structures. So we have much more differentiation. We have so many different models of families. So we have, patchwork families where you have children with different partners. We have families that don't even live together, who live apart together. So we see this kind of more individualized society. But what happens, interestingly, with every big mega trend is that there is a counter trend, a trend that comes against it. So what we're seeing now is the more individualized, is the more we're all getting into our little individual bubbles in society, the more we need support from other people. And this is why we believe we're seeing the big trend to co-living spaces where people have shared spaces in an apartment block, for example, or co-working spaces. That's also a sign that people don't want to be living, working alone at home, even though we can because we're digitalized, we're mobile, we're flexible. And it's the same with the living situation. We have a very high percentage of single households throughout Europe, but people need connectivity. They need to build relationships with people, with friends. They don't have the old structures that they used to have. They don't live where their parents, maybe their siblings are, or their grandparents. So I think what we're seeing is this counter trend to looking for new types of community, new types, if you like, of family. And that's a kind of classic trend, counter trend.
Okay. When we talking about architecture, we mostly discuss the design, the functionality, the technology as well. Rarely the discussion focus on the people that are using this architecture. Do you think that contemporary architecture is human-centered enough? Do architects implement social changes in their designs?
I think what we're starting to see is a much better awareness of what architecture does to our psyche, to our quality of life. There's a whole branch of what we call neuroarchitecture, where we look at the neuroscience, so what it does to our brain, what do certain spaces do to our brain, what do they do to how we feel. And there's a very good example. We're seeing a lot of the big trend towards micro-living, people living in smaller apartments because a lot of people are living alone or they can't afford a big space today. And what's happening is that people's feeling of well-being is actually being reduced. It doesn't mean just because you live in a smaller place that it makes it cozy. What actually happens is that in your brain, your threat alarm system is triggered. So this means that people actually can feel very uncomfortable in smaller spaces. And I think what architecture is starting to do is recognize that, or good architects are starting to recognize this. And what they're starting to do is understand that we need a kind of a counterpoint to that. So that people, if they live in a smaller space, they need other places they can go to. So they need the shared spaces within the building. So they need maybe another room which they can cook in, a library or a communal living room. So we're starting to really, I think, understand a bit more about the effect of architecture on people.
So 2020 is almost here. It is here.
It's here.
So, yes. And that was the year that we thought we will have flying cars, personal robots, that we will live maybe on Mars and so on. Nothing of this came true yet. But how could the future city in reality look like based on your research, on your perspective of the future?
I think what we forget is it's a very slow process. So I think if we think about the city of 2030, for example, it won't be so different to how it looks today because it's a very slow adaptation process. I think it's funny, I did some research a while ago about visions of the future, and I remember reading about Ljubljana in the 60s, how the city planners said, oh, don't worry about public transport or roads because we'll all be flying around in the air in the future. And apparently that's why you have such difficult traffic problems in Ljubljana. So it's a big lesson, if we have these fantasies and we don't think about them in human terms, in practical terms, then we can sometimes make the wrong decisions for the future.
That's really true. But okay, how does a future home look like? How can the design adapt these social changes that you mentioned before?
What I think, if we want the ideal home of the future, we have to think about building more ecologically. And there's a movement which I'm very much in favour of, which is cradle-to-cradle building. That means that you can take more or less a house apart at the end of its life or its useful life and reuse every material to its original quality, which I think will be very important for the future. It's very expensive at the moment. And I think what we're starting to see is a bit of a backlash against the so-called smart home. Everybody's talking about pushing in technology. We can do everything over an iPad, how wonderful that's going to be. And I think what's interesting is it actually stops us communicating with people because we're just fiddling around with more screens. And we see that with Alexa, for example. People who have Alexas and these Echo Dot and these digital assistants at home, what often happens is that the people don't talk to each other, they talk to the device. And you're starting to see, problems in relationships. We call that technoference, where technology interferes with communication. And I think we have to get over this bubble, this euphoria that we have about technology, and come back, if you like, to a more analog life. I think technology is useful. We need it in terms of ecology, so we can have more energy-efficient homes in the future. But we have to be careful about which technology we introduce into our private lives.
So more low-tech.
Low-tech, high-tech solution. Yeah.
So maybe the last question. What would you suggest architects that they can become better at designing the future cities and buildings? Do you have any tips for us?
I have one word which I think we need to think about as architects or city planners, relationships. There's an architect in America called Jeannie Gang, and she says she doesn't build houses, she doesn't build buildings, she builds relationships because cities are about people. And what she tries to do is organize her buildings so that they're socially smart, so that people naturally come together. And so, in a world where we're getting more lonely, where we're getting more digitalized, where it's harder to communicate with people face to face, she's trying to create ways where people can communicate in an analog way. And she does it, for example, over in a high-rise building. She's got this high-rise building in Chicago called Agua. And what she's done is she's created a vertical village. She said she wants to recreate how people used to communicate with each other in the horizontal. And what she's done is she's misregistered the balconies. Normally you would build a balcony so that you don't see your neighbour, but she's built them so that they're misregistered. So you have to talk to your neighbour. So it's like talking over the old fence that you used to talk over the garden fence. But this is in the vertical. And I think little tricks like that are something we can learn from for the future. I think it's a lovely way to try and encourage people to communicate and in an analog way in the city of the future.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk.
Thank you for the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, bye. Poslušali ste podcast Odprto. Prvi slovenski podcast o arhitekturi, ki ga je pripravila ekipa OHS. Za akustično ugodje je skrbel studio Sonolab. Odprte hiše Slovenije se zavzemajo za dobro arhitekturo, ki je namenjena vsem ljudem. Prisluhnite nam vsakič, ko boste o prostoru želeli izvedeti več.
Da smo lahko odprto spregovorili o prostoru, nam je svojo podporo omogočilo Ministrstvo za okolje in prostor.